I couldn't be more excited to be here and to meet everyone. I've seen so many people in the React community from Brazil, and I didn't know that I would get this chance to come and see everyone, so thank you. Wow. So today I want to tell you about Apollo and GraphQL, and in particular, one thing that I've been hearing a lot recently is that there are just so many different tools now that are popping up for GraphQL, and so many different things built by the Apollo community. It's kind of like React, where it's not necessarily clear what every single tool is for, or which one you're supposed to use. So what I want to talk about is, first of all, what are some of the main benefits that we might want to get from GraphQL? And also, how can we use Apollo and a bunch of other tools to get those? So first of all, who are those Apollo people anyway? Well, the most important thing is that it's a whole community of people. There are literally hundreds, I think, probably up to 1,000 now different contributors that have gone on GitHub and contributed to the documentation or code of a bunch of different Apollo repositories. And that could be you, so please come and join us. But the most important thing for us is to make it easier and more straightforward to build great applications. And we feel that GraphQL is one of the best ways that we can contribute to that and make application development easier, because GraphQL has so many things to offer as part of that process. Today's apps are pretty complicated. Back in the day, you could fire up a FTP thing and upload a PHP file to somewhere, and you pretty much had an app going. But today, it's a lot more complicated. There are a lot of different front-end platforms like iOS, Android, tablets, Internet of Things, all kinds of stuff. And you often have to build a different app for each platform. There's usually also a lot of different backends where your data lives. You don't just have one MySQL database anymore. There are all kinds of APIs, microservices, all kinds of places where you have to get that data from. And if you're at a larger team or a larger company, sometimes you have to deal with coordination between a lot of different people trying to work together on the same product. And I think Apollo and GraphQL are uniquely suited to solve a lot of those concerns for people, because a lot of them have to do with delivering data. But first, let's set the stage a little bit and talk about what these technologies are that are involved. So how many people here have used GraphQL before? Okay, about a third. So hopefully you can see a little bit here, but if you don't see here, you can always go to graphql.org or graphql.com, which is where I ripped off some of these screenshots to learn about it. But the most important three parts of GraphQL to me are, first of all, that there's a schema definition. So every single GraphQL server has a complete definition of the schema of all the types and fields of data that are available from that server. And there's a query language, which is a fully specified language you can use to describe the data you're trying to get from that server. And then the third part of GraphQL, I would say, which isn't technically part of it, but I think is just as important, is the huge community of different tools that have been built. There are GraphQL implementations in almost every single language, every single front-end technology, every single editor. Anything you can think of, there's probably some sort of GraphQL integration for that. And I think that's the main reason that GraphQL has been more successful than a lot of other types of technologies that were similar to that, like Falcor or OData, because those never had as many integrations with as many different technologies. So why is it that GraphQL in particular has so many benefits? Well, it's because of those first two parts, because of the schema and because of the queries. It's impossible to have an underspecified API and to have lots of ad hoc stuff in it. You always have a clear and reliable description of what you're doing. And all of the GraphQL tools, as you'll see in a bit, rely on that to do their magic. So what's Apollo? Apollo is nothing more or less than a collection of tools built by a community of people. They can be broadly grouped into client-side tooling, which is something that a front-end developer might use to build the UI or integrate into their editor, and server-side tooling that helps you set up and understand a GraphQL API. And I'll post all these slides later so you can look at the specific list of stuff that I put on there. But there's really three core benefits that I think you can expect if you go all in on GraphQL and Apollo and all the related tools, and you spend some time maybe setting some of that stuff up. Here are the things I think you'll get. You'll be able to develop new features and new products much more quickly and more easily, and you won't have to think as much when you're doing it. It'll be much easier to maintain that application going forward, understand the security, and coordinate with other people on your team or on other teams. And you'll get the ultimate understanding into what exactly is going on in your application. You'll be able to go at a glance and understand what data is available, how is it being used, who's using it, where, does my app even work? So let's look at those one by one to understand how this whole stack gives you these benefits. Let's start with easy development. That's probably the simplest one. So today I'm pleased to report that GraphQL is easier than ever before. It was released probably about 2 years ago, a little bit more than that. And I remember the first thing that was ever released for GraphQL was pretty much this Relay Starter Kit. And you can definitely download and run it, but it wasn't really clear exactly how all the different parts of it worked. 2 years later, there's so many more tools and so many more tutorials. There's this great website, howtographql.com. It's now super easy to get started with GraphQL and just as easy as any other technology. I strongly believe that right now it wouldn't take you any more time to build an application with GraphQL than it would take with a REST API, which was a common conception and actually the truth 1 year or 2 years ago. And then once you get that set up, you'll have huge benefits to your development time because of this flexible approach to data, and that instead of dealing with a bunch of individual API requests, you can declare your requirements with a single query and get all that data in your UI more or less automatically using tools such as Apollo Client. And it's really easy to prove it by showing you pretty much an app that is very, very simple. So one of my colleagues, Peggy Razis, has started a video series on our YouTube channel called Mission Briefing, where she goes over very small examples. And these 2 slides are about an example that she created, which lets you have a GraphQL server that retrieves information about different currencies. And then she also put together a very simple UI to attach GraphQL data to a React component inside Code Sandbox. And so directly in your browser, if you go to these URLs later, you'll be able to see a simple app that in just a few lines of code creates an API and creates a UI to analyze the most trendy of things, which is, of course, cryptocurrencies. So you can check out your favorite cryptocurrency on that app later. And I think where this is really going to shine is once you start adding those features to your app. You know, when you're working with React, the best part is you don't have to think in terms of pages. You can just think in terms of small components. So if you have a new view that you need in your app, you can just take the components you already have, maybe make 1 or 2 more, and slam them together. GraphQL, you can do a very similar thing, but now with your data. Instead of having to create an entirely new endpoint, which is something you will often have to do to have an efficient data loading for a new page in your app, you can now reuse the existing fields you have, maybe add a field or 2, and have all the data you need for that new page in your app that you're trying to build, or maybe even an entirely new app. So I would argue that GraphQL is like a component-based API in a way. It gives you some of the same benefits that you got from building your UI with React, but this time for your API. And of course, there's some proof. You can read articles online, like from the same colleague of mine, of people who have moved to GraphQL, and not only did they put themselves in a good place to build their app later down the road, but they actually saved code and made their app work better even during that migration process. So the same way you might make your app work better by switching from jQuery to React and reduce the amount of spaghetti code you have, you might have the same benefits moving from a different API technology or data management to GraphQL. It'll make your code simpler, less code overall, fewer things to manage. So in general, the point here is you can spend less time managing data and more time building your application. You don't have to worry about loading state tracking. You don't have to worry about the format in which your data is stored. You don't have to worry about error handling. You just do it inside your component. And you don't have to worry about managing those requests. And on the server, it's great for server developers as well. Because even though GraphQL right now is not as well understood as some API technologies, at the end of the day, there's less work to do because you don't have to be building new endpoints all the time. You can describe the data that you have with those GraphQL fields and types, and then your front-end developers can just use that without having to come to you to get new endpoints pretty much for every feature. So what's the Apollo team's goal here? Where do we come in? Well, like I said, GraphQL used to be pretty hard and complicated, and I hope we've had a pretty big impact on making it a lot easier and simpler by building some of the tools and writing some of the content we have. And my main thought on this is you shouldn't have to choose between using the best option and using the easiest option. Just like React is not very hard to learn, it should be just as easy to learn the best option for data management. And that's my dream for Apollo. So we have a huge focus on documentation. We write as much as we can to make it so that every common use case like pagination and other kinds of things are covered in that documentation right away. And we're also focused on constant technical improvement. So for example, Apollo Client 2.0, the next version of our GraphQL client library, is now 5 times faster and 2 times smaller, but you don't have to change almost any of the code that's using it. So we're going to keep working on that to make sure that at the end of the day, nobody has an excuse to not use GraphQL in their application. Okay, so the second main benefit for GraphQL, after you've been able to build your app much quicker and much easier, is making it easier to maintain down the road, making it easier to collaborate across different teams. So the first and easiest thing is that because you have this GraphQL schema and GraphQL queries, and they're fully specified, so every single application in the world that uses GraphQL is using the same language for the schema and the query, you can easily compare them to check if they're valid. So for the first time, you can actually take your UI code and your server-side code and tell if it's going to at least execute. You're not going to end up with a situation where, you know, an endpoint on your backend changed randomly and you didn't know about it, or you wrote a query with a typo and then you deployed your app, or something like that. So you can always set up something to automatically check that your app is correct, even across the stack. And there's this really great article about it by Zach Silveira. He writes a lot of really great content about GraphQL, React, of how you can use some of these tools to actually validate your code base and even integrate into your editor. So here's an example of Visual Studio Code where, like James showed you before in his previous talk, you can validate your queries directly in your editor. And one of those tools is the ESLint plugin, which lets you not only see that a query is invalid, but actually underline the exact part of your code that you need to update for it to work against your server. And then Apollo CodeGen, which is a tool that converts the thing on the left, which is a GraphQL query, and it uses the schema to generate fully specified Flow or TypeScript types or a bunch of other types of languages that describe that query. So not only do you get to check that your query is consistent with your server, you get to check that your query is consistent with the UI code that is consuming that data. So you can be a lot more confident that when you deploy that app, it's actually going to work. And I think the key insight here is that you're actually validating code across boundaries where you often wouldn't have been able to do it before. You can check that your server and your client are going to work together, and not only that, but check multiple servers and multiple clients at once using these tools. And some of the great guys at Entria have built a tool, I think maybe Sibelius, I saw his commits on this one, built a great tool called GraphQL Find Breaking Changes. So for example, for every commit to your GraphQL schema, you can check if it's had breaking changes or not, and you can be pretty confident that it's correct because it's impossible to implement a GraphQL server that doesn't describe all the types it provides. And then on the server, there's a couple of great tools as well that enable new workflows. So in addition to being able to validate your code, you can actually build up a schema without any actual code in it and check if it's going to work and try to run some queries against it. So in particular, in this example on the left, we have a mocked schema where you just have a schema string and it'll have fake data in it. On the right, we have a new feature in this GraphQL tools library that lets you do schema stitching, which means you can take multiple GraphQL schemas and then combine them into one that can be queried with one query. So for example, if you have microservices and you want to start implementing those microservices in GraphQL, you can actually have an API gateway that works automatically and combines those together using this or other open source tools. In fact, in the last month, I like to think it's partially because we released this tool. A lot of other people have been talking about their internal schema stitching implementations that they use to create a unified API gateway on top of their GraphQL microservices. And again, there's a link to a post here. So that's all cool, but I think the coolest thing is the new workflows that this enables. Because at the end of the day, I don't think GraphQL really matters. What really matters is how fast you can build your application and how good it is. So we've been calling this approach GraphQL first, which is you can think about the thing that is actually the contract between your client and your server. You could also call it schema first, maybe. So you can agree on a schema ahead of time between the front end and the back end team. And then you can actually mock out that schema, letting the front-end team develop ahead of time against that mocked API, and let the back-end team take their time implementing those fields. And then at the end, you can stick them together and have a working application. But now, just a week ago, we released this schema stitching solution, which means you can now actually combine a mocked API with a real API. So if you have a real production API, and then you want to add a new feature, but the API for that isn't done yet, you can mock just that part of the schema. And so you can build that new page for your app, build that front end, and then fill in that mocked part of the schema with the new fields that you got from your backend developer. So at the end of the day, I think this really embodies the second concept that I've wanted to talk about, which is enabling better collaboration between teams in your company, or even between yourself, because often when I develop applications by myself, I also feel like my own enemy, because I'm like, who added that thing? And it was me yesterday. It's funny, like I was in a 24-hour hackathon once with my friend, and we ran into the need for a schema definition for our API like 3 hours in, because she was changing stuff and I wasn't aware of it. And so even in a very short time frame, you run into the problems that are solved by this approach. And again, why GraphQL? I mean, there are all kinds of other technologies that promise the same benefits. And I think it's because GraphQL is the only technology in the world that combines the strongly typed schema with a specified query language. You can't select all of the fields from your API. You have to type out exactly which ones you want, which enables all these benefits for validation. Plus, there's this approach with GraphQL of putting your GraphQL queries very close to your UI components, which means that doing something like validating that code between the query and the component is a lot more realistic. Because if you were auto-generating code for your REST API, that would probably be quite far away from where you're actually using that data inside your React component. So you would still have to generate a bunch of types manually, for example, for your Redux store or something else. So I think GraphQL is uniquely positioned to have these kinds of benefits. So the last thing I want to talk about today, in addition to making it much faster and easier to build your app and making it easier to collaborate across teams, I think GraphQL gives you a huge edge in understanding your API and how it's being used. And just going back to those benefits of GraphQL again, the first important thing here is that it's the same system for building the API and validating that it matches a certain schema. So you might have heard of systems like Swagger or API documentation. Weird. But the problem is those are often incomplete or they're out of date. I've met tons of developers going to companies and talking about GraphQL that don't trust their Swagger schema definitions. Because they were written by hand, they're often missing fields or are completely incorrect. With GraphQL, that's not possible because there's no way to have an untyped GraphQL API. And that's built into every library you might use to create a GraphQL server. And the same thing for the query. You know exactly which fields are being accessed. So for the first time, you can actually know which of those fields in that strongly typed API are being used. Because you're strongly encouraged not to request fields that you're actually going to use in your UI. You can kind of trust that query as a measure of how your API is actually being used. Okay, so how do you actually use this information in real life? Well, there's a tool called Apollo Optics that we also produce. It's not the only tool that does this, but it has a particularly UI directed at solving this problem. So for example, this is a screenshot of one of the pages from Optics where you can see your GraphQL schema, and you can sort it by how often different fields in your API are used. So what would you do with that information? Well, there's a couple of things that aren't even particularly creative. First of all, you can know which fields you can remove, which is pretty useful because sometimes in other kinds of APIs, it feels like you can never really remove anything. Once you've added a field to your API endpoint, who knows who might be using that field or not using it? You probably have to increment a new version just to remove one of those fields. You probably can also use this information to know when to start optimizing for performance. If a field is used a lot, you'll get a lot more impact from making it faster. And then the other really cool thing is that going from those fields in that schema, you can go back and look in your query logs and see which queries are using those fields, which will let you understand which parts of your front end might be relying on the fields in your API. And because those queries are attached to particular UI components, it really gives you an understanding across the whole stack. And that's actually another really interesting thing. One of the benefits of a REST API, perhaps, is that an endpoint usually refers to an individual piece of data. And in GraphQL, it's a little bit different because you have all these different queries that might be fetching data in different ways, even though it's kind of the same data. You know, it might have one or more field here or there or something extra. However, if you only have endpoints that return a particular entity, for example, a user, you might not know how that user endpoint will affect your UI's performance. Because if that field, like if you've looked in the GitHub API, before they switched to GraphQL, they would have endpoints that would return like 200 fields at once. And so it would be very hard for them to tell which of those fields are being used. And if they had more specific endpoints that gave you particular fields of the user, they would be able to understand what to do. And so that's why I think it's actually, in some ways, a benefit that GraphQL has a much more diverse way of making requests because you can understand how that data is being used. One thing I think is really cool And I think this really ties into a new idea we've been working with of thinking about how more of these different GraphQL tools might work together. Is on the left is a screenshot of Optics, which is this tool that ingests data from your GraphQL server to help you understand how requests are being made. And on the right are the Chrome dev tools for Apollo Client that let you understand which queries are being used on a particular page of your app. So similar to Redux dev tools, you can look into your data system and understand what's going on and what's being loaded. And I think the future of Apollo is actually going in the next, some time period, hopefully, connecting all these things together. So you can easily go from understanding which queries are on a page to clicking a button to seeing how that query is working in your server, to clicking a different button and executing it against your server, or maybe adding it to your tests. Because these queries and these schemas are used across the whole stack, all of these tools can integrate with the same system. So I think that will be very, very cool. The other really cool thing you can get with GraphQL that you also can't get with anything else is per field performance. So because a GraphQL query has all these individual fields that might be fetched separately from a backend, you can actually understand which of the fields are expensive and which ones are cheap. And you can use that data for a lot. And most importantly, it gives front-end developers the power for the first time to affect how fast their requests are. Before, if you're making a request, if it's slow, you just have to deal with it. The only thing you can do is talk to the backend developer and try to get them to improve it. But with GraphQL now, if you understand which fields in that request are fast and which ones are slower, you can actually remove that field or put it in a separate query to make your application load faster without having to change the backend at all. And I think that's a very important feature. And on the server side, understanding the breakdown of those different fields inside a query will let you know how to attack the problem of, for example, your front page not loading quickly, because you can look at that query and understand what the critical path is that is blocking it from being faster. So let me tell you about the next step for GraphQL Insights that I'm really excited about. And this is Apollo tracing. Apollo tracing is a new thing that we've been working on, which is an open standard for describing performance data for a GraphQL API. You can check it out on GitHub right there. The really cool thing about it is it's already been implemented in all of these different GraphQL servers. So if you're using GraphQL and using it with Node, Ruby, Scala, Java, Elixir, even if you're using the WordPress GraphQL integration, you can turn on Apollo tracing today and start getting performance information from your server in a totally open source way. You'll get timestamps of all those resolvers and all those fields. And I have really high hopes for the standard. If you guys have used Graphical, it's this tool you can use to run GraphQL queries against your server. I hope that in the very near future, right next to the result from your server, you'll also get a report of the performance of that individual query. And that's actually possible today. The only thing that's missing is for one of you to write that UI component that displays those timestamps. So call me and tell me if you're going to do it, and I will help you out. And there's a lot of other things you could do. For example, supporting timing from the underlying backends and databases, or supporting schema stitching so you can connect performance data from multiple GraphQL APIs together into your API gateway. So zooming out for a bit, how does this all work together? So this is something that we've been thinking about as a concept of maybe an Apollo platform. So because GraphQL is used everywhere, think about having all these different tools that seamlessly work together using GraphQL queries and schemas to give you greater insight and understanding into what's going on. And this is kind of a diagram of all the different categories of tools that we see: client, server, and Optics, which is this thing that reaches into your server and helps you understand how it's working over a longer period of time. And the future, I think, looks very similar to Apollo tracing. I think it's very important that any future developments that we build in Apollo, just like in any other GraphQL tool, are built around something that the entire GraphQL community can use and integrate into any of the tools that are being used there. I think it'll be really valuable for everybody to have more tools that integrate across the entire stack so that front-end developers and back-end developers can work better together. And my first point here, I think, is also very important, which is incremental adoption is critical because nobody will be able to use any of these things if you can't put it into an existing application. So just to summarize, I think the core benefits you'd get from using Apollo and GraphQL and using all the tools together are easy development and speeding up your development time, better maintenance and coordination, especially across your teams, and understanding into how your application data works. But the most important thing is you can choose to get only some of these benefits. You don't have to install everything at once. You can start with just that first diagram of having just one server and one client and already see a reduction in your complexity or code base size, and you can add all of the other bells and whistles as you need to. So thank you very much, and just like James, I've got you a promo code for GraphQL Summit. So if you would like to check that out, please go to the website and sign up, and use the React Brazil code. And here's my contact information. You can tweet at me, email me. If you have any ideas or thoughts about how GraphQL or Apollo could be better, please let me know, and I would love to talk to you about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sashko.